7. The double doors leading to the next section of the tomb swung open with an appropriately deep and querulous creaking groan. "I really wish they hadn't done that," Perry commented nervously. Images from any number of horror films kept popping into her thoughts, reminding her of the traditional fate reserved for tomb robbers, or even those like themselves who were merely passing through, as it were. The doctor sighed. "I trust you are not going to continue to jump at every shadow." "Okay, doctor, don't rub it in." The doors opened onto a broad flight of stairs, leading up into the darkness. They ascended cautiously until they reached another set of doors, which were closed but not sealed. These opened almost silently compared to the first set, revealing a larger space beyond. Perry swung her torch about the interior of the new chamber. "Wow! Jackpot!" she exclaimed. The room was circular, perhaps 20 yards across, with a coffered hemispherical roof vault some 8 or 9 yards at its highest. From the chamber's contents, there was no doubt of its function. In every item her torch beam touched, Perry seemed to see the answering flicker of gold, the pale glow of alabaster, or the contrast of ivory inlaid on ebony. There were statues, figurines, gilded pots and jars, decorated caskets, and chests of all sizes, highly ornamented chairs, couches, and stools. Some of the furniture incorporated stylized animal heads embodied in their framework or as decorations, and Perry found the jeweled eyes of caricatured lions, hippopotami, and crocodiles twinkling back at her from the confusion of riches. She wandered entranced down an aisle between the stacks of priceless relics until she came to a clear space in the very centre of the room, which was marked by a concentric pattern set in mosaic on the floor. Here she turned around, dizzy with the sensation of discovery. She was surrounded by the most fabulous collection of ancient funerary goods she had ever seen. This was how Howard Carter must have felt entering Tutankhamun's tomb, she thought, except that Tutankhamun's tomb was a garden shed by comparison. History in the making, the splendour of the ancient world. Then her sense of perspective caught up with her. This was not history. The Queen, in whose honour all this had been assembled, had only died a few years ago. Most of the artists and craftsmen who had fashioned these exquisite things were probably still alive in the here and now she was presently occupying. She sighed, feeling confused. The doctor kept saying that everything was relative, and the TARDIS certainly proved it. But did it make her surroundings any less wonderful to know that, metaphorically speaking, the paint was still wet around the edges? She looked about her again, noting a second aisle winding between the stacks of treasure. "Hey, Doctor!" she called out. "There's another of those fancy doors here, with the rope seals and so on. Wonder where it goes to." "Probably the sarcophagus chamber itself, I would think." "Oh, well, we'll leave that be then." "Look at this," said the doctor. He had also been examining the treasure whilst she had been lost in her thoughts. Now he was shining his torch on one particular item. Perry crossed over to him and brought her own torch to bear. A sense of déjà vu assailed her. It was an exquisitely detailed model of Cleopatra's royal barge, which, from Perry's point of view, she had been photographing on the Nile only an hour before. But it was a model with striking differences. Gone were the banks of oars and the long steering paddles. Instead, there were twin paddle wheels and a stern post rudder. From the deck rose a tall funnel. "I guess there's no doubt about it," said Perry. "We have definitely slipped sideways in time into one of those parallel worlds you told me about." The doctor's face was contorted into an intense scowl of concentrated thought. "It would seem so, and yet I'm not certain." "Oh, come on, Doctor. What else can it be?" "There should have been some indication on the console readings." After the way they've been knocked about and with the low power and all? Perhaps, the doctor mused. I suppose we shall simply have to explore beyond this tomb and discover what lies outside. The good old empirical method, Perry chipped in. We assume it is Rome, continued the doctor. But what version of Rome will it be, if we have truly entered a parallel timeline? He raised an expressive, quizzical eyebrow at her. Well, let's get out there and find out, huh? The suspense is killing me. She turned towards the door they had come through. No, not that way. Look at the roof. Puzzled, Perry pointed her torch upwards. Amongst the radiating ribs and recessed panels that formed the ceiling were 4 slotted openings, spaced evenly around the curve of the dome and about halfway to its apex. When she moved her torch beam to one side, she could see a distant gleam of skylight, as though from the end of a long, narrow shaft. What are they? Ventilators? They would perform that function when the tomb was being built, certainly. But they sometimes served more mystic purposes, such as allowing the spirit of the deceased an easy path to heaven. They might also be aligned with specific stars or the sun at a particular time of year for a form of resurrection ceremony. Well, they might be fine for a spirit to slip through, but no way are we going to make it. They can't be much over 6 inches wide. Remember the molecular cutter? I can use that to widen the aperture. But those shafts beyond must be at least 5 or 6 yards long. That's a lot of rock, Doctor, and the cutter doesn't cut all that deep at one go, does it? Why can't we just go out through the antechamber door? It would manage that easy. Because it is most unlikely that the door simply opens out onto the street. And if it did, think of the attention we would draw if we suddenly emerged from Cleopatra's tomb. Until there is evidence to the contrary, we must assume there is a busy city outside, which we would be well advised to inspect from a distance first. In any case, it's probable that there are more doors and passages beyond the antechamber pair, all of which will be barred, sealed, and even buried. Considering this tomb is relatively new, they might be guarded, or perhaps open into a secondary temple in current use. Okay, Doctor, you've sold me, but it's still going to mean a lot of digging. The doctor beamed, like an overgrown schoolboy with a secret. Possibly not. Everything we have seen indicates a fusion of different cultures, both in religion and architecture. This vault is not Egyptian, but an advanced Roman design. So, I can still see a lot of stonework between us and the outside. There has to be if we're inside some sort of pyramid. Perhaps it looks like a pyramid on the outside, but I doubt if the Romans would go to the trouble of constructing it of solid stone. I don't think a chamber this size could support the weight if that were so. Perry was beginning to catch on. You mean it's hollow? There's a good chance that at least the upper part is, but, as you said earlier, we must be empirical about that matter. Let's get a ladder and find out. 10 minutes later, they were shifting several priceless pieces of furniture to make a space under one of the vent slots. Perry was horrified at the thought of damaging anything, but also increasingly annoyed with the makers of the more substantial pieces for not having learned how to build anything lightweight. This, she suspected, had not troubled Cleopatra, who probably had people in to do her removals. Eventually the space was made, and she gratefully flopped down on a Shay-Long-style couch, uncaring about what the previous owner would have thought of the liberty. Phew! Is it hot or cold in here? I can't tell. The doctor was mopping his brow with a large white handkerchief. It's a trifle enervating, I admit. Possibly the rather dead air in here, he coughed, and the dust doesn't help. He blew his nose loudly. Anyway, we must get on. There'll be plenty of fresh air outside. The ladder the doctor had brought from the TARDIS, Perry discovered, was an ordinary aluminium extending type that she could have found in any hardware store back in her own time. It even bore a well-known brand name. Propped up against the lower lip of the vent shaft, it seemed oddly out of place, symbolizing the mass production ethos of another age, standing as it did amongst uniquely handmade goods. By further contrast, the molecular cutter the doctor was checking over represented the science of a time perhaps as far removed from Perry's own as she was from 10 BC. A handheld projector unit, in the form of a thick silver tube, was connected to a heavy rectangular energizer unit by a coiled cable. It made no sound when it operated, but Perry knew it could cut through most materials, like the proverbial hot knife through butter. As a bonus, it could also rebond them invisibly afterwards. A neat trick, she thought. The doctor clipped the unit to his belt and ascended the ladder while Perry steadied its feet. He reached the vent, and Perry could hear him muttering to himself in apparent satisfaction. "Stand clear below," he ordered dramatically. There was a moment's silence, then a scrape of stone over stone, and a slice of Roman concrete roof vault broke on the floor. For the next few minutes, there was a steady rain of such fragments. Perry could see the doctor was cutting away one side of the narrow vent shaft so it was wide enough to take his shoulders, whistling tunelessly as he worked. He came down the ladder, adjusted it so that it projected further into the excavation, and ran back up again. He was up to his waist in the hole when there came the crash of a heavy slab falling all of a piece. "Are you okay?" Perry called up anxiously, only to see the doctor's legs disappearing through the hole. There was a long silence, then, "Come up and take a look." He sounded pleased with himself. Cautiously, Perry climbed the ladder, torch in hand. She felt a momentary dizziness halfway up, and had to take a few deliberate deep breaths. "I really will be glad to get out of this place," she thought. Reaching the hole the doctor had cut in the roof, she found the cause of his satisfaction. He is going to be insufferably smug for having worked this out, she told herself. The dome was, she estimated, about a yard thick where the vent shaft pierced it. A fine wire mesh, presumably to keep out insects, had been cut away to reveal the shaft beyond, which was formed of relatively thin slabs of stone bound together by metal cramps and straps, and supported by heavy timbers. She could tell this because one of the side slabs, the one she had heard fall, was missing, revealing a void beyond, from which came the flash of the doctor's torch. Perry scrambled through, scraping her knees, and found herself in a space resembling a huge attic. A forest of posts and struts, braced against the curve of the dome, supported the rafters of a great sloping roof, which faded into the gloom on either side of her. It was the inner face of one side of a pyramid. "Interesting construction methods," said the doctor, who was squatting on the curve of the dome, playing his torch beam over the interior. "Finely dressed limestone slab facing, with inner joints sealed and bedded with pitch and sand. Spare me the lecture, Doctor. I can see it's all very clever, but where do we go now?" "Downwards. There is a level floor where the dome ends, and we can reach the base of the pyramid wall. Then it should only mean cutting away a section of relatively thin slab to reach the outside." "But where will we be then?" "On the roof of a temple, I rather think." "Well, anywhere's better than in here," said Perry, scratching irritably at some grit that seemed to have gone down the back of her shirt. "I just want to see some daylight." A minute later they were standing on a level floor at the base of the dome, amid the chippings and scraps of builder's waste, and the doctor was cutting a neat ovoid out of the middle of the lowest wall slab. It came free, and they eased it to the ground. Low morning sunlight flooded in through the opening. They squinted against the brightness, breathing in the fresh air gratefully. Even the doctor, Perry noticed, seemed to be glad of the change. Beyond the guttering channel was an expanse of flat stone slab roof, broken only by a flat-topped structure walled by fretted stonework, rather like a simple skylight. Otherwise, there was no sign of movement, except for a few birds wheeling in a blue sky, dotted with a few puffy clouds. They slipped through the hole and stood upright. Perry realized that the pyramid cap of the tomb rose from the middle of a great square expanse of roof, presumably of the surrounding temple building. The doctor was looking around him in satisfaction. Yes, quasi-Egyptian design, you see, but executed with Roman techniques of detailing and construction. As they walked away from the wall of the pyramid, the skyline of Rome unrolled before them. They lay flat as they reached the edge, and Perry peered cautiously over a low parapet to the ground some 50 or 60 feet below. A broad flight of steps led down from the colonnade fronting the temple to a wide stone-flagged plaza, presently occupied by pedestrians dressed in variously coloured robes and tunics. Perry edged back a little. It wouldn't do to be seen up here just yet, she thought. Judging by the sun, they were facing almost due south, so Cleopatra's tomb was set on a hill to the north and east of the centre of Rome. Possibly one of the famous 7 hills, Perry realized, trying to remember their names. She could see the line of the Tiber snaking off across the plains to their right, crossed by several bridges, leading to a sprawl of buildings flowing up the hills on the further bank. She was surprised how small the city itself seemed, no more than 3 miles across at the most, she estimated, being bounded by a straggling fortified wall. Its centre was a confusion of broad plazas and rows of monumental columns, and the great angular roofs of temples, all lying along different axes. Towards the outskirts, the streets seemed to narrow, twisting between blocks of apartments 3 or 4 stories high, with a few grander buildings dotted between them. One large drum-like structure stood out distinctly. Was it the Colosseum, she wondered? It was some moments before the details that were out of place registered, because in other circumstances they would have been quite unremarkable. Doctor, do those poles running along that street down there look like they're carrying electricity cables? And are they anything to do with those, street lamps I think I can see next to them? Yes, I believe they are. And have you noticed the roof of that large building to the left of the central forum? Oh, yeah, the one with radio aerials on, you mean? And look out over the plain to the east. Perry's eyes followed the line of the multiple arches of an aqueduct that marched out towards the distant hills. There were a lot of buildings in the far distance, with smoke rising from them, like a small industrial works. Then she saw what the doctor meant. About a mile from the city walls, the pale, streamlined form of an airship trailed from its mooring mast. Suddenly, she realized what one of the background shapes in the anteroom frieze had been. It had been oddly distorted, and she supposed they must have been quite new at the time and given the artist some trouble. These guys have sure been busy, she stated. But how long has it taken them? I mean, when did they take off on a different track of history? If those paintings on the walls downstairs are right, then the Battle of Actium was the turning point. So whatever it was must have happened long before that, right? The doctor inclined his head politely, in agreement with her reasoning. But, she continued, that means in less than 25 years, say, they've also invented electricity generation, airships, radio, and who knows what else. Even if what we see is all they've got, it's quite an achievement. Well, the doctor replied, this culture was probably more prepared, technically, to take the first steps of an industrial revolution than Northern Europe was 1700 years later. But I agree, this is far too much progress in such a short space of time for it to be natural. They must be working from finished designs. Consider all the painful years of research and development that would save. But how? And who or why? That we will have to find out. Still, it's some shortcut, Parry conceded. But dangerous, he responded grimly. Your own age can hardly keep pace with a constant stream of technological changes and the social and ethical problems arising from them. Ability must not outstrip wisdom. What all this might do to these people, I shudder to think. Perry thought she had never seen him look so grave. She tried to sound a brighter note. Well, at least they seem to have power going spare down there. Maybe we can tap into some to recharge the TARDIS. Yes, that must be our next step. Then, well, we shall see. He started to work away from the roof edge. First, of course, we must get down to the ground. Perry was sitting upright, scratching again. Say, do you think there were any bugs in the tomb? She asked, rolling up the sleeve of her shirt. I seem to be... She gave a little choking gasp of fear. Fine, dark feathers were growing out of her forearm. She looked at the doctor in mute horror. He was right at her side in an instant, clasping her hand with firm reassurance. It's all right, Perry. Let's get back to the TARDIS. Don't worry. Convulsively, Perry tore open the top of her shirt with her free hand. A diamond patch of feathers was spreading across her sternum and down between her breasts. She was trembling with shock. Varos! She stuttered shrilly. It's Varos again! With an effort, the doctor got her to her feet, and, half carrying her, he helped her stagger back towards the hole in the pyramid wall. Then, just as they reached it, Perry distinctly seemed to hear him mumble, Sorry, but I don't think I feel quite... And his legs buckled, and he collapsed forward and lay motionless at her feet. For a terrible moment, she stared at him uncomprehendingly, her mind reeling under the double shock. Then she felt down, feebly tugging at the arm of his coat. No, please, Doctor, not now. I need you to help me. There was no response. She heaved and managed to roll him over onto his back. The face staring up at her was that of a younger man, with thin, sensitive features and paler, straight, flaxen hair. It was the face the doctor had worn when she had first met him.